Hello and welcome to this recording for How to Be a Linguist. My name is Dr. Jessica Mason. I'm a lecturer in the English language team. You probably won't have met me yet because I'm not currently teaching first year, but you'll see me next semester for linguistic creativity. So I'm going to talk to you today about a piece of research that I have been working on over the last year or so, and about some data that I collected over the course of summer 2019. I'm going to talk to you about the kind of linguist that I am, and in particular two areas of linguistics that I draw on in this study: stylistics and corpus linguistics. The study is called Talking About Texts, and I'm looking forward to explaining to you a little bit about what it is and what I've been up to in my research. So just a quick overview of the things I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to explain a little bit about what corpus linguistics and stylistics are, because I appreciate you may not have come across them yet so far in your degree. I'm going to talk to you about some key claims that I make in my research about book talk. Book talk just literally means talking about books. So one of the things that I'm particularly interested in my research is when people interact about texts, in particular thinking about works of fiction, but not always, what kind of things do they say? And what informs what they do and don't say. So I research this kind of language use, this kind of book talk, in lots and lots of different contexts, from anything from people giving online reviews to people talking in classroom or education contexts about books, to reading groups. And in this particular context, I'm going to talk to you about some responses that I elicited from quite a large sample of people in an anonymous survey about their book talk practices, getting them to really reflect on what informs what they do and don't say, and what they are and aren't willing to admit to. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Talking About Text project itself. I'm going to tell you some stuff about who participated, because I think that's really important for this particular study. And I'm just going to show you a couple of some of the early findings, because this is actually an ongoing bit of research that I'm still working on as we speak. So I'm not going to be able to give you the full findings, but I'm going to give you a flavour of what they look like. So stylistics is something which we are very proud to specialise and be leading in at Sheffield Hallam. There are several of your lecturers that specialise in this area, and stylistics is really nicely and concisely defined by Leach and Short here as simply defined as the linguistic study of style, which is the way in which language is used. So in essence, stylistics has as one of its key kind of principles the idea that whenever we talk and whenever we write anything, that consciously and unconsciously we're always making choices about which words to use and the order in which to put them. And that by making those choices, some of which are conscious but most of which fall below the level of our conscious awareness, that creates a particular style in a given moment, a particular way that somebody is speaking, or a particular way that a writer is writing, and that by looking closely at what those stylistic choices are, about those lexical choices or grammatical choices that have been made, that we can start to understand that style and pull it apart and understand better what's going on in that particular text, whether it's spoken or written. There are really two key principles that underpin stylistics as a particular area of linguistics. The first one is the idea of having a common currency of terminology. So there are lots and lots of terms that we use to talk about various bits of language, many of which are things that are common across linguistics more broadly. So many of these you'll have come across in your describing language module so far. But we like to engage those terms and use them consistently. So if we're looking at verbs or verb phrases, we're very clear and explicit about that, and we call them verbs and verb phrases. But there are lots and lots of other bits of terminology that we use in stylistics as well, and this will be something that you'll come across in much more detail in your second year when you come to your style and interpretation module. But the reason that we really put an emphasis on that is we like to be really, really transparent about how we do analysis, which bits of language we're talking about, and we like things to be open to other people having a look and checking what it is that we're talking about, being clear about what we've labelled, which bits of language we're focusing on. And we think that a really important way in which to achieve that is to engage this terminology. So we're not just using it for its own sake or to show off the fact that we know what a noun is. We're doing it so that everybody can be part of the same conversation and everybody knows which bits of a particular text or a bit of data somebody is looking at and can go and look at it themselves and sort of confirm or even challenge the things that people are arguing on that basis. And linked to that is this second principle, which is an emphasis on textual evidence. And Stockwell, I think, summarises the importance of this really nicely. He says that this ensures that claims are open to agreement or falsifiability, open to verification and checking for accuracy, and are fundamentally testable. So we never sort of make claims about what particular texts do or what their style is without showing the bits of that text that we are drawing on that have caused us to come to those conclusions. Again, it's almost, I like to think about it almost like showing your working out in mathematics, which you always get told to do in school. I always remember being told to show my working out, and I always think that stylistics, it borrows that same kind of principle. So it says, let's show you all of the text that we're talking about, and let's engage a common set of terms when we're talking about them so that everybody is on the same page and everybody can see what we're doing. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about corpus linguistics in a moment, but stylistics is really kind of the disciplinary approach that I adopt in that. So I've said to you already that I'm really interested in this thing called book talk, when people talk about books, particularly fiction, but all sorts of other kinds of books too. I'm also really interested in how people talk about films and television shows, and a lot of my work looks at the intersection, the interaction between book talk and identity. And I want to make these three kind of key claims which are based on the body of research that I've done over the past 10 years or so. So based on all of the research that I've done so far and all of the research from other scholars in the field, I want to suggest to you that talking about books, films and television shows is intrinsically bound up with our sense of identity. It's impossible to get away from. And this is because asking people things like, what's your favourite book, or have you seen this film, are not, I would suggest, neutral questions. There are all sorts of things that we process really quickly in our mind, sometimes about, does this person think I should have read this book? Is this person going to think I'm stupid if I haven't read this book? Am I supposed to like this film? How am I going to come across if I say that I really like this television show? And sometimes our answers can change depending on assessments that we make, again, very often below the level of our conscious awareness, about how we think we might be judged or how we think we might be perceived based on our answers to those questions. And because of that, I want to suggest to you that people have many, many reasons to misrepresent, to twist slightly, or sometimes even to actively lie about what I would call their narrative knowledge, the books that they have read and they haven't read, the films that they have seen and they haven't seen, the television shows that they are familiar with or have never heard of, and their narrative preferences, which is a fancy way of saying their kind of tastes, their likes and dislikes, what they're into, what they're not into. And again, that this comes from this idea about book talk, talking about books, being bound up somehow with our sense of identity. And I think that that counts even on very, very broad principles, like if somebody asks you if you like to read, depending on who asks that question, you might give them different responses. And sometimes it's something that we observe in schools a lot. I do a lot of work based in secondary schools in particular, that you can create contexts where children will be encouraged to say that they don't read even though they do, because they're worried that their friends might think that they're geeky or might think that they're a nerd. And similarly, we might be in a context like an English lesson where students who don't read pretend that they do because they think that that's the answer that the teacher wants to hear. So these are all of the things that kind of what I would call the social minefield of book talk that I'm really interested in my research. So what I think is that we can say, what we say about books can vary hugely depending on the context that we're in and who we're talking to. So a good way to summarise that would be to think about talking about books, television shows and films as being a socially loaded activity. Now in stylistics, we're really interested in what real readers say about books all the time. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is when you get people who go out and do these studies where, for example, they might record a reading group and listen to their responses, or they might look on Amazon and look at the reviews around a book. What are the things that we also need to consider when we're dealing with that kind of data around this sort of social minefield that might also inform what people think and how that might be different from the things that they actually say? So when I was coming to put together this particular research project, talking about text study, I'm going to talk to you about in more detail in a moment, These were some of the initial research questions that I had floating around in my brain that I then sort of used to crystallise into a research design and come up with this particular study. So I was interested in things like, when do readers share honestly about what they have and haven't read, about what they do and don't like? Do they lie about what they have and haven't read, or is that just me? Do they lie about what they do or don't like, or is that just me? How often do they do it? Why do they do it? What kind of role do emotions like embarrassment play, or fear of judgment? Now, often when you're shaping a research study, you realise that you can't answer all of these questions. And so as I was developing this study, I decided that I thought that a questionnaire, a survey, was going to be the best way for me to generate a large number of responses, because I felt like I needed quite a large group of participants in order to get a clear kind of picture, a good sense of what this might be like amongst people. But I also decided that it would be really, really important for it to be anonymous, because I'm asking people questions about their sense of identity, and I'm asking about some quite sensitive topics like embarrassment. People often don't like to talk about when they're embarrassed about things, because it feeds into the very fact of them having been embarrassed in the first place. So these were the two things that I came up with first, is that it needed to be some sort of questionnaire, some sort of survey that I would then distribute online so that I could maintain that anonymity, and that I wasn't going to ask people for lots and lots of details about themselves. I wasn't going to ask for their name, I didn't ask for their gender, I didn't ask for their age. I started to think about what kind of bits of information do I need to know, but how can I make sure that the people who participate in this study are going to feel anonymous? Because I think sometimes anonymity is not just something that someone can give you by saying, oh, well, just don't tell me your name. It can also be something that we feel, in that if you ask people for lots and lots of personal details, even if that doesn't include their name, that they can start to feel sort of identifiable. And I felt for this particular bit of research, it was really, really important to avoid that. So those are some of the things that fed into me coming up with the Talking About Text project. And I mainly disseminated it on the social media site Twitter, because I work very actively on there for other parts of my job, and spend a lot of time talking about research on there. And if people clicked on it, this is what the screen that they were shown. So this is what we call participant information. It's the bit of information that we think that participants need to know before they participate in any kind of research that we do. It's very important for ethics, to make sure that people know what they're consenting to be involved in, they know what they're agreeing to. But also at the same time, we have to have a little bit of a balance here in terms of thinking about how much information do I need to give to participants so that they can make an informed choice about whether or not they want to be involved? And at the same time, how can I phrase this quite carefully so that I'm not influencing the kinds of answers that they're going to give me? So this is what the opening said. It said, this is a questionnaire. We'll ask you questions about your feelings, about reading, and your experiences of talking about books with other people. It's part of a research project that's looking at how we think about our reading habits in relation to our identity. By reading, we mean physical books, ebooks, and audiobooks. We don't mind how you've read them. The questionnaire is completely anonymous. Not even the researcher will be able to find out who you are. You won't be asked for your name, your email, or any information that could link back the answers back to you, and the question won't save this information. And so it went on. So you can see there probably straight away that whilst my personal research interests extend not just to books but also to films and television shows, that one of the decisions that I made when I was doing this research was that it was going to be too messy and too complicated to focus on all of those things. So I focused this study, which is why it's called Talking About Texts, not talking about stories, down to looking at reading and book talks specifically. And you can also see that I very much foregrounded to the participants the idea of this being anonymous, because I felt that it was really, really important in order to get good data that was actually going to be useful to me, for the participants to be really, really clear that they could answer sort of with impunity, with no sense that these answers, these things that they were going to share with me as a researcher, were ever going to be traceable back to them. And these are some of the questions, so I'm not going to have time to talk you through all of them, but to give you a flavour about the kinds of things I was asking participants in this study, here are just 3 examples. Have you ever read and enjoyed a book that you'd be reluctant to tell others about? Are there any circumstances in which you might lie about reading a book that you hadn't read? And do you ever feel embarrassed about books that you haven't read? So these are the kinds of things to really try and get at understanding a bit better this social minefield, these things that float around whenever we're asked questions about books or whenever we engage in conversations about books. These were the kinds of things that I was interested in. So just to give you a little bit of information about who participated and the sort of scale of this study, there were 653 participants. I collected that over a period of about 2.5 months that the survey was open for, that I was sort of re-advertising it and sharing it. And that yielded 644 responses, because a few people, you have to ask people questions about consent. It's a requirement for research ethics, and there were a couple of people who didn't answer all of those questions, so I then had to remove their data, because if we don't have full informed consent and evidence of it, we can't use that data that people give us. Survey was anonymous, I've said that already, and these were the 3 pieces of information that I decided that I did really need to know about the participants in order to have a good contextual understanding of their responses. So nothing that was identifiable, but these 3 things I felt were really important. First, would you call yourself a reader? And they were given 3 options to answer that: yes, no, or it depends. Roughly, how many books do you read in an average year? And how would you best describe your job or your profession? This can be a current or a previous role. Now, the reason that I asked them about their job is because, first of all, I do a lot of work with teachers, and I knew that by disseminating this survey on Twitter that I would get a lot of people who worked in education and worked in teaching, and specifically English teaching, responding to the survey. But this and many other jobs, I think, are often bound up with book talk as part of their professional identity, as part of their job. And so I felt this was something that was really important to know, because I think how an English teacher might respond to do you ever feel embarrassed about books you haven't read, might be very different than somebody who works in a role that has no link whatsoever to talking about books as part of their job. I wanted to know how many books they read in a year to get a sense of whether or not these people read often and prolifically, and also because I suspected that there might be some patterns that I could draw out in the data there. So I obviously wouldn't know until I got the data in front of me. But I suspected that possibly people who don't read very much might feel more embarrassed about things they haven't read, and that possibly there might be a sort of a threshold over which, if someone reads a very large number of books a year, that they might not really care about things that they haven't read. Because they sort of feel that they read a lot anyway. So I was interested in finding that out. And then I was also interested, because this is a survey about identity, and how people self-identified, but whether they saw the identity of being a reader as one that they had, or that one that wasn't familiar to them. And this is the split of responses that I got between those 644 people who participated, whose data I could use. So you can see the very vast majority said yes, they would call themselves a reader, with a few people saying it depends, and a really small number of saying no. Now this, I think, in itself is really interesting, because does this suggest that participating in research about books is something which is appealing to people who would call themselves a reader, and possibly is it identity threatening, something that you don't want to do if you don't think about yourself as a reader? So I think there's something interesting that we could find out there initially, but also that's important then to inform my analysis and my understanding of the responses that I've got have mainly come from people who would self-identify as a reader. Again, these are the results from roughly how many books do you read in an average year, and you can see that a really large number of people read more than 25 books a year. I'm not quite sure how they were counting those books or what they were including, but we could say, and I compared this to our sort of national statistics, that there's a really strong overrepresentation in the people who responded to this study of people who read a lot. So again, really important to understand and contextualise the data that I was going to get from this, is to know that as really important information as a researcher, that the people I'm talking about are not representative of the general population in terms of how much they read. It's very much skewed towards the end of people who read quite prolifically and read a lot of texts. And here's the split of people talking by profession. These obviously aren't the exact answers that they gave. I went through and did a thing called coding, which is where you separate based on a set of rules that you have generated for your particular study. how you're going to divide and code, separate out the different responses that you've had. So you can see that not quite, but nearly half of the people who participated were teachers, which I told you was what I was expecting. Over 100 of them were academics. Another 87 worked in some other area of education, and 10 were librarians, and the rest fell into sort of a more general set of roles. So there was everything from lawyers to stay-at-home parents, to people who were unemployed, people who drove ambulances, doctors, all of this sort of thing. So again, opportunities here potentially for me to look at, okay, well, what do teachers say in response to some of these questions compared to librarians? What do people who have no role in education whatsoever say compared to people who do? So lots of opportunities for interesting things that we can look at as a result of this data. This generated around 87,000 words worth of data, which sounds quite large. If you think that your average novel is about 100,000 words, that should give you a rough kind of sense of what it is and what it looks like. But a proportion of this were yes and no answers, so they weren't narrative responses. It gave me a combination of qualitative and quantitative data, so things that I can do numbers and statistics with, and stuff that I can go and read and people share sort of open responses to some of these questions. So as a result of having this quite large data set, like 87,000 words is really too much data to be able to look at in really close, fine detail manually. That was what informed my decision to use a bit of corpus linguistics as well. And I was also interested in some stylistic analysis of some of the patterns of how people responded to these questions. So corpus linguistics, I'm not going to explain in great detail to you now, but essentially it is an approach within linguistics which uses computer software to process very large sets of data for us very, very quickly and allows us to identify patterns. So the Click Dickens site, which I've just displayed for you here, is a really good example of a bit of corpus software, and I think you're going to encounter this at various points as you proceed through your degree. 87,000 words is actually quite small for a corpus study. Some of the corpuses that we look at using this kind of approach have databases that are millions and millions of words large, but it does some really interesting things. It allows you, for example, to identify what are the most frequent words. So I could search a particular word in my data and see how many times it appeared. I could look at where it appears. I can get the software to show me whether or not particular words appear near those words. I'll show you a few examples of that in a moment. So using a combination then of this stylistic and corpus approach, so reading through the data and identifying patterns and then checking those using this bit of software to tell me how frequent these words are. These are the specific titles, the authors and the genres that people mentioned when they were answering this survey. So I'm not going to read these through to you. If you want to pause the screen, you might be quite interested to think about why is it that these are the kinds of names that come up when people talk about reading and their sense of identity. Some really interesting things, and this is a good example I'm going to show you of some stylistic patterns that emerged from this data, is that there are different levels of prominence afforded in referencing either particular titles or particular authors. So when people talk about being embarrassed or being reluctant to talk about a particular book or pretending that they have read a book when they haven't, sometimes it's really clear that there is a common pattern where people think that this is about the particular text, and sometimes that they think it's about the particular author. So 70 instances of Harry Potter, for example, but only 4 mentions of J.K. Rowling. 19 instances of 50 Shades of Grey, but no mention of the author. So for these two things, clearly it's about the book. There's something about the book that people are interested in. I thought that was a really interesting pattern. Interesting too that sometimes people full name authors and sometimes they don't. So when you're talking about Jane Austen, people normally call her Jane Austen, but when it's Charles Dickens, they normally refer to him as Dickens in this data set. This is just a really interesting thing I want to show you of patterns that sometimes we identify that I don't really know why this is the case, why people talk about it in this way. It's an interesting thing to observe. It's not something I was after finding out in this study, but I'm continually sort of reflecting on why that might be and where those different patterns, those different bits of prominence might come from. So when people are making those stylistic choices about whether to say Jane Austen or Austen, clearly there is some consistency in what people are deciding to do, but I don't yet really understand why those stylistic choices are being made. It might be an interesting thing for you to reflect on, and please do email me if you have a great idea about why this might be. So I'm partially occluding this title, but just to show you a few more bits of the data. Are there any circumstances in which you might lie about reading a book you hadn't read? Is another question that I asked. 247 of the participants said yes, and 388 said no. So quite a large proportion said yes, and I thought this was really interesting. Because when you start to drill down into why people say this, so I asked them to kind of explain themselves, that you started to see that actually it was a bit more complicated than just a straight yes or no. So looking in particular at the narrative responses of what people had written when they'd said no, there was some really interesting patterns that emerged. So people were making a distinction very often between what you might think of as active and passive lying. And there was a real divide amongst participants and some real contradictions in what people thought actually counted as lying and what didn't count as lying. So people were sometimes describing exactly the same behaviours, things like nodding along, things like going quiet and removing yourself from a conversation. And some people would count that as lying and some people wouldn't. Lots and lots of people qualified their no's by saying, I wouldn't do it anymore. And I thought that was a particularly interesting thing to observe. And people often said that they wouldn't, but the reason that they wouldn't was because of fear of getting caught. So from an identity point of view, not that they didn't have the impulse to lie, not that that thing didn't exist for them, but that they had another motivation not to do it, which was being worried about getting caught. Again, I'm not going to stop on this, but if you just want to pause this video, this is an interesting sort of flavour of some of the responses that I had about what counts as lying and some of the contradictions I've just talked to you about. Just to show you a last bit, do you ever feel embarrassed about books you haven't read? Really almost sort of even split here, so 54% of people said no and nearly 46% of people said yes. Now thinking in particular about the information I showed you earlier about who was participating in this study, I thought this was really high and quite surprising, and I had some interesting reflections on why this might be. Is it because of the participants that I've got, that lots of them do have jobs that mean that their identity is likely to be quite closely bound up with what they have and haven't read, what they do and don't like, whether that's because of their role in a university or a school, or whether that's even more specifically around being an English literature teacher, for example. Do these people have a much closer sense of identity bound up with their sense of things like embarrassment? Do English teachers feel like they should have read everything? Or is this reflective of views in the broader population? And there are things that I could do with the quantitative data that I've got that will, as I move through analysing this project, give me a clearer sense about whether these patterns are common across all the different professions of people who responded to this survey. And the last thing I'm going to show you was, again, so that was the kind of quantitative question. That's the thing that gave me the raw kind of numbers about who said yes and who said no. And then afterwards, the next question was, could you say a bit more about this? And these were some of the patterns that I observed. So that lots of people who said yes, they did feel embarrassed about books they hadn't read, sort of confirmed my suspicions that they felt this way around particular people, and in particular the expectations about them typically relating to their job made them feel this way. And lots of people engaged the same metaphor when they were talking about this. So stylistically this was really interesting to me. They invoked this idea about gaps. I feel like I've got gaps in my reading, as though they were conceptualising a reading history as something that should be whole, and when they reflected on their own they felt there were gaps in them, and that those gaps were the places where they felt embarrassment and sometimes indeed a temptation to lie. And participants who said no, again, there were some quite consistent patterns in what they said. So they said things like, I'm too old to care, I don't care anymore. I read lots and it's impossible to read everything. So sort of confirming some of the hypotheses that I had going into this study about, is there some sort of threshold over which when you read that much, you read more than 25 books a year, that you don't feel embarrassed about things you haven't read because you understand it's impossible to read everything. So it becomes almost incidental that you haven't read this particular book rather than something that says something about you as a person. and some people talking about why should I, and reading as a personal choice. So I hope you've enjoyed this sort of brief overview of the study that I've been working on at the moment, and that I've given you a bit of a flavour of some of the results. I hope you enjoy the rest of your class, and I look forward to seeing you in semester 2 on linguistic creativity. Thank you very much.